There are certain people who seem to speak directly to the part of us that has grown tired of ordinary reality. Not because ordinary reality is false exactly, but because it can feel unbearably incomplete. Bills, traffic, deadlines, inboxes, routines, the mechanical repetition of modern life. And somewhere underneath all of that, a quieter suspicion, a feeling that this cannot be the whole thing. That consciousness is stranger than we admit, that the world is deeper than it looks, that meaning hasn't vanished, only gone underground. And when someone arrives who can speak to that feeling with confidence, poetry, a kind of ecstatic intelligence, people listen. Terence McKenna was one of those people. He didn't sound like a conventional thinker. He didn't sound like a careful academic trying to hedge every sentence. He sounded like a man standing at the edge of the known world, shouting back strange and beautiful reports about mushrooms, about language, about time, about history, about the possibility that the human mind is not a sealed chamber at all, but a doorway, a threshold, a receiver picking up signals from something older, wilder, and more alive than modern civilization knows how to handle. And that's what made him so compelling. Because McKenna spoke to a hunger that a great many people feel, even if they don't have the words for it. The hunger not just to understand life, but to re-enchant it. To feel that the universe isn't dead matter arranged into useful systems, but something participatory, something speaking, something that might, under the right conditions, answer back. But this is also where things become slightly dangerous, because the line between revelation and projection is not always easy to see. The line between insight and intoxication can get blurry. The line between opening the mind and building a private mythology so elaborate that it begins to trap you inside it is thinner than most of us would like to admit. And dear old McKenna lived on that line. Born in 1946 and dead by 2000. He became one of the most recognizable voices in psychedelic culture through his books and recorded talks, especially in the late 20th century. He wrote about shamanism, altered states, language, plants, evolution, and consciousness, and he did so in a way that made even the most outlandish idea feel strangely intimate. He wasn't just arguing for psychedelics. He was trying to restore a sense of cosmic depth to a culture he believed had become spiritually anemic. So this isn't an episode about drugs or counterculture or the lingering perfume of the 60s. It's about something more difficult and more human than that. It's about the need to believe that consciousness is meaningful. It's about what happens when intelligence, imagination, and spiritual longing all begin pulling in the same direction. And it's about what we do when the world we have inherited feels too small for the size of our questions. Terence McKenna gave a generation a language for wonder. He also gave them a language for excess. And that's what we're stepping into today. Not just the life of a psychedelic thinker, but the mind of a man who tried to talk his way to the edge of mystery, and perhaps beyond it. 835. Terence McKenna didn't emerge from nowhere. Voices like his never do. They're usually the result of several worlds colliding at once. A temperament already inclined toward wonder, a historical moment that no longer trusts the official story, and a mind restless enough to go looking for meaning in places most people are taught to dismiss. Before McKenna became a psychedelic oracle to thousands of listeners, he was a boy growing up in Colorado with a fascination for nature, fossils, and the strange textures of the world. Long before he was talking about language, shamanism, and the hidden architecture of time, he was paying attention. And Buddha said that once, don't listen to me, pay attention to the world. Because the roots of a worldview are often much older than the theories that later grow out of it. The need to look more closely usually comes first. The explanation comes later. He was born Terence Kemp McKenna on November 16, 1946 in Pioneer, Colorado. Accounts of his early life consistently point to a childhood shaped by curiosity about the natural world. He collected fossils, read widely, and developed interests that didn't sit neatly inside one discipline. Psychology drew him in early, especially Jung, and that attraction makes a great deal of sense when you look back on the man he became. Jung offered a way of seeing mind not as a private little machine sealed inside the skull, but as something symbolic, mythic, and porous. For someone like McKenna, that was never going to be a casual interest. By his teens, he was also reading Aldous Huxley and becoming aware of psychedelics, not just as substances, but as philosophical provocations, not merely chemicals, invitations, challenges to the accepted map of consciousness. And the broader culture, of course, mattered too. McKenna came of age in the long shadow of the 1960s during a period when faith in institutions was fraying and the promise of modernity was beginning to show its cracks. Science had immense explanatory power, but it could also feel spiritually empty. Consumer culture had convenience, but not depth. Religion still had symbolic force, but for many people it no longer felt fully alive. In a climate like that, figures such as McKenna were not accidents, they were responses. He belonged to a generation that inherited unprecedented access to knowledge and mobility, while also inheriting a deep suspicion that the modern West had become severed from the sacred. That suspicion would become one of the central engines of his thought. He would later call for an archaic revival, but the emotional logic behind that phrase was already there much earlier. The sense that something vital had been left behind and that modern people no longer knew how to speak to mystery without embarrassment. In 1965, McKenna enrolled at the University of California, where he entered the Tussman Experimental College. Even that detail feels strangely appropriate. Berkeley in the mid-1960s wasn't just a place to get an education, it was a pressure chamber of political unrest, experimentation, and philosophical searching. It was one of those rare environments where the boundaries between scholarship, rebellion, spirituality, and theatre became hazy. McKenna didn't move through that world like a conventional student. He became increasingly interested in shamanism, Tibetan religion, language, and visionary experience. In 1967, he travelled to Jerusalem where he met Kathleen Harrison, who would later become his wife. Not long after that came further travel through Nepal, Southeast Asia, and beyond. These journeys weren't decorative episodes in the life story, they were a formative moment. Travel for McKenna was not tourism. It was a way of loosening the grip of the familiar, a way of stepping outside the assumptions of his own culture in search of other forms of thought, ritual, and perception. There's also something important to say here about his style of intelligence. McKenna was never a narrow specialist. That was part of his strength and eventually part of his problem. He moved laterally, not vertically. He read across mythology, botany, alchemy, religion, anthropology, history, literature, and psychedelic research. He collected ideas the way some people collect artifacts, with delight, instinct, and very little interest in disciplinary customs. To a sympathetic listener, that made him vivid and alive. To a skeptic, it made him slippery. But in the beginning, before the more extravagant claims hardened around him, this breadth gave him real magnetism. He sounded like someone trying to think in civilizational terms, someone trying to put shattered fragments back into one picture. And there's a genuine human appeal in that, because most of us feel the fragmentation even if we lack the language for it. We live in compartments. McKenna wanted totality. No relationship was more important to the emergence of McKenna's early thought than the one with his younger brother, Dennis. If Terence became the more famous public voice, Dennis remained crucial to the story intellectually and experimentally. The two were collaborators as well as brothers, a reminder that ideas do not appear in isolation. They are often forged in dialogue, in shared obsession, in mutual escalation. In 1971, the brothers travelled to the Colombian Amazon, to a place called La Chorrera, in search of psilocybin mushrooms and, more broadly, some kind of breakthrough in consciousness. This journey would become one of the defining events in Terence McKenna's life and the seedbed for much of what followed. Later, it would be recounted most fully in True Hallucinations, and its intellectual aftermath would shape the invisible landscape, the 1975 book he wrote with Dennis. La Chorrera is where the biography of McKenna starts turning into myth. It's where the ordinary frame begins to buckle. And here, it's important to be careful. The La Chorrera story is central, but it is also exactly the sort of story that can take on a feverish glow if told uncritically. What we can say with confidence is that the Amazon experience became foundational for McKenna's intellectual identity. It deepened his commitment to psychedelics, intensified his interest in language and metaphysics, and helped generate the speculative material that would later become associated with his more visionary and controversial ideas. It wasn't just a trip in the casual sense, it became, in his own telling, an encounter with the edges of mind, matter, and meaning. Whether one interprets that as revelation, psychological crisis, symbolic eruption, or some blend of all three, depends very much on one's prior commitments, but there's no question that for McKenna himself, La Chorrera marked a before and after. After returning, McKenna went back to Berkeley and completed his studies, graduating in 1975 with a degree in ecology, shamanism, and conservation of natural resources, an unusual combination that sounds almost too perfectly tailored to the man he would become. Soon after, he and Dennis published The Invisible Landscape, Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching. Even the title tells you a great deal. This was not the work of someone content to remain inside accepted academic lanes. It was an attempt to map hidden structure, to draw lines between mind, psychedelics, divination, and reality itself. This is also the period where McKenna began lecturing more seriously, first around Berkeley and on underground radio, slowly becoming not just a thinker with ideas, but a voice people remembered. Plenty of unusual books are written. Very few generate a speaker whose cadence alone can begin to function as a form of authority. McKenna was becoming that kind of figure. So by now, we don't yet have the fully formed Terence McKenna that most people recognize. We don't yet have the polished public lecturer speaking in those rolling, luminous paragraphs about mushrooms, novelty, culture, and the transcendental object at the end of time. But we do have the ingredients. A child captivated by nature, a young man drawn to Jung, Huxley, and altered states, a traveller searching for shamanic knowledge beyond the West, a brotherly collaboration that turned experiment into worldview, a mind trying to think across everything at once, and already, if you listen carefully, you can hear the first fault line opening up beneath the whole enterprise. Because what made McKenna compelling from the start was also what made him unstable. His refusal to stay inside ordinary categories could feel liberating. It could also make it harder to tell where insight ended and projection began. The same imagination that allowed him to see connections others missed might also allow him to see connections that were never there. And that tension, still only faintly visible here, is the one that will shape everything that follows. Plenty of people travel, read widely, take psychedelics, and return with unusual conclusions. Very few become a voice that people replay for years. Very few become a presence. Terence McKenna did, and to understand why, we have to look not just at what he believed, but at what he offered. He offered a way of seeing the modern world as spiritually damaged, historically confused, and in need of a recovery of lost forms of consciousness. He offered a story big enough to make people feel that their private intuitions about meaning, alienation, and mystery weren't foolish after all. By the 1980s and early 1990s, McKenna had grown into one of the most recognizable public voices in psychedelic culture. He lectured widely, appeared at workshops and conferences, and built a reputation through the circulation of recorded talks that were copied, traded, and replayed long before the internet made that sort of thing frictionless. He was not simply known for advocating psychedelics. He was known for speaking about them as though they belonged to a much larger civilizational argument, one that included ecology, myth, language, technology, metaphysics, and the fate of human consciousness itself. That breadth was central to his appeal. He didn't talk like a man selling a lifestyle, he talked like a man trying to redraw the map of reality. And the people were ready for it. McKenna emerged into a culture that had become highly literate in information and increasingly starved of meaning. The modern West could explain more and more, but many people no longer felt that explanation alone was enough to live on. Rationality could describe the machinery of the world, but it often left untouched the question of how to inhabit the world with wonder. Institutions spoke in procedures, advertising spoke in appetite, politics spoke in slogans. Religion for many had become either too brittle or too vague. Into that landscape stepped McKenna, talking in rolling, strange, intelligent sentences about mushrooms as teachers, about archaic consciousness, about direct experience, about the possibility that the crisis of modernity was not merely political or economic, but ontological. That the problem ran all the way down to how we perceived reality itself. This was not merely provocative. It was nourishing to the right kind of listener. One of the key ideas that made him so compelling was what he later called the archaic revival, which became the title of his 1991 book. At the heart of that idea was the claim that modern civilization had not advanced cleanly away from the past into something healthier, wiser, or more complete. Instead, it had amputated itself from older, more participatory forms of consciousness. McKenna believed industrial modernity had intensified abstraction, hierarchy, alienation, and what he often called dominator culture, while suppressing ecstatic, communal, ecological, and shamanic modes of being. The archaic in his thinking was not simply primitive in the dismissive sense, it was ancestral. It was a memory of a more embedded relationship with the natural world, with symbol, with ritual, and with the felt mystery of existence. Even without agreeing with every part of what McKenna was saying, many people recognized the feeling beneath it. The sense that modern life fragments attention, isolates the individual, mechanizes nature, and drains symbolic life of its force. McKenna gave that unease a mythic vocabulary. He made alienation feel old, intelligible, and perhaps reversible. He didn't simply say that people were stressed or spiritually disconnected. He implied that history itself had taken a wrong turn, and that altered states might help us remember what had been lost. This was an intoxicating idea. Then there was his argument about psychedelics themselves, especially psilocybin mushrooms and DMT. McKenna treated these not as entertainment or escape, but as technologies of encounter. He was insistent about the importance of direct experience, a phrase that comes up repeatedly in accounts of his thought and public speaking. This was one of his strongest rhetorical moves. He positioned psychedelics not as doctrines, but as invitations to test the boundaries of the self. That gave his worldview a kind of anti-dogmatic sheen, even when his own speculations could become quite elaborate. He wasn't saying, at least not at first glance, believe me. He was saying, look for yourself. Now that's a very powerful move because it allows a teacher to sound radically liberating while still shaping the framework through which the experience will later be interpreted. And his books helped consolidate all of this. The Archaic Revival gathered essays, interviews, and narrative pieces into a more coherent statement of his civilizational critique. Food of the Gods, published in the early 1990s, pushed further, linking psychoactive plants and drugs to the history of culture and even to theories of human evolution. This is where his so-called stoned ape hypothesis became widely associated with him, the idea that psilocybin may have played a role in the emergence of language and higher cognition in human ancestors. Whether persuasive or not, it had exactly the qualities that made McKenna hard to ignore. It was bold, transgressive, sweeping, and imaginative. It took a mushroom and turned it into a civilizational actor. It took prehistory and made it psychedelic. It took a fringe intuition and gave it cosmic stakes. But none of this would have landed in quite the same way without his voice. Now this is one of the most important things to understand about McKenna. He spoke beautifully. Or perhaps more accurately, he spoke in a way that made beauty and intelligence feel inseparable from speculation. He had cadence, timing, wit, a gift for the unexpected phrase. He could move from anthropology to alchemy, from machine elves to James Joyce, from the forest to cyberspace, without making it feel like a pile of disconnected references. He gave his listeners the sensation that consciousness itself was improvising through him. Now that's a dangerous gift, because it can make even weak arguments feel illuminated. But it's still a gift, and it explains why recordings of his talks continued to circulate for decades, long after the original moment had passed. There's also something psychologically important happening here. McKenna didn't just provide ideas, he gave people permission. Permission to suspect that reality was stranger than it appeared. Permission to distrust the flattening habits of institutional life. Permission to feel that wonder was not childish and that the hunger for transcendence was not an embarrassment. In that sense, his function was almost priestly, though he would have likely disliked the word. He gave language to experiences that many people found overwhelming, incommunicable, or socially illegible. He made the private shimmer of altered consciousness sound discussable. And that was important because human beings often need more than experience. They need a frame that makes the experience bearable, meaningful, and shareable. McKenna was exceptionally good at building those frames. But this is also where the first real trouble begins. A frame can clarify experience, but it can also colonize it. A compelling interpreter can help you notice what's real and can also quietly teach you what to expect. McKenna's genius was that he widened the imagination. His danger was that he could widen it so forcefully that it became difficult to separate encounter from suggestion, insight from atmosphere, revelation from rhetoric. When someone speaks with enough conviction, enough elegance, and enough mythic fluency, their worldview can begin to feel less like one possible lens and more like the natural shape of reality itself. That's especially true when the subject is altered consciousness, where experience already resists ordinary categories and arrives carrying its own emotional authority. By now, we can see what made McKenna so compelling. He offered wonder without apology. He offered critique without the dead language of policy or academia. He offered a spiritual imagination that felt both ancient and futuristic. He made the world feel alive again. But in doing so, he also created the conditions for a deeper problem. The very qualities that made him expansive also made him difficult to resist. And once the voice becomes difficult to resist, the neat story starts to fray. There is a point in the life of almost every compelling thinker where the quality that made them vivid begins to turn against them. The imagination that once opened doors starts building labyrinths. The courage to question accepted reality starts sliding toward the inability to accept any limit at all. And what makes Terence McKenna so fascinating and so difficult is that you can almost watch that threshold forming in real time. The minds that could make the world feel alive also had a tendency to press beyond the point where aliveness becomes explanation, and explanation becomes system. That's where this story darkens, not because McKenna becomes uninteresting, but because he became too interesting in a very dangerous way. By this stage, McKenna was no longer just talking about psychedelics as catalysts for wonder or tools for direct experience. He was building increasingly expansive interpretations around what those experiences meant. This is where his thought begins to move away from civilizational critique and towards cosmology. Language is no longer just a human tool, it becomes something almost magical. Psychedelic encounter is no longer just psychologically disruptive, it starts to suggest contact, transmission, intelligence, an elsewhere that may be more than symbolic. History is no longer just a messy unfolding of human events. It begins to look, in McKenna's telling, as though it was a direction, a pull, an attractor. The human hunger for pattern was always present in his work, and now it starts to harden into metaphysics. To be fair to him, this is part of why people loved him. He refused the smallness of ordinary explanation. He spoke as if reality itself were unfinished and participatory, but there's a cost to that refusal. Once a thinker begins treating the intensity of an experience as evidence for the structure of the universe, the ground becomes unstable very quickly. Psychedelic states can be profound, transformative, and even life-altering, but that doesn't mean they function as transparent windows onto objective truth. They may reveal something, they may reveal a great deal, but they may also generate their own internal authority, their own emotional force, their own counterfeit certainty. And McKenna, for all his brilliance, often seemed willing to treat visionary force as a kind of philosophical credential. Now that's not uncommon in spiritual subcultures, it's just usually expressed with less eloquence. This becomes clearest in his novelty theory, sometimes known through the phrase time wave zero. McKenna developed the idea from reflections on the I Ching and his own psychedelic experiences, especially those linked to La Chorrera. Broadly speaking, he proposed that time was not neutral or uniform, but had fluctuating qualities of habit and novelty, and that the universe was being drawn toward increasing complexity by what he called a transcendental attractor at the end of time. He eventually associated this accelerating movement with a specific endpoint in 2012. The theory was, and remains quite obviously, widely regarded as pseudoscience. Critics have pointed to its Critics have pointed to its numerological basis, its shifting end dates, and its lack of empirical grounding. Of course, novelty theory wasn't just one odd theory among many. It revealed something essential about McKenna's relationship to meaning itself. He didn't merely want reality to be strange, he wanted it to be ordered by strangeness. He wanted the symbolic and the historical to lock together. He wanted the world to disclose not just mystery, but design. In a sense, novelty theory is what happens when an intuitive, poetic mind falls in love with its own patterns and then asks them to bear more weight than they can carry. It's less a piece of science than the drama of the human longing for hidden coherence. But its significance remains, even if we can consider it a failure, because most of us do some version of this. We notice a pattern, then tell a story, then mistake the story for a structure built into reality itself. McKenna just did it at full volume with the whole cosmos on stage. The same problem hovers around what became known as the stoned ape theory, which McKenna popularized in Food of the Gods in 1992. This was the idea that psilocybin mushrooms may have helped drive major developments in early human cognition, including language and higher awareness. It's exactly the kind of theory McKenna was unusually good at producing: bold, imaginative, boundary-breaking, and unforgettable. It's also exactly the kind of theory that the scientific community has largely ignored or rejected as unsupported. Once again, what matters here is not merely whether he was right or wrong. It is what kind of intellectual posture this reveals. McKenna was often most persuasive precisely when he was least constrained. He could turn speculative possibility into felt plausibility through tone, rhythm, and conceptual audacity. And that's a rare talent. It's also how charismatic thinkers end up outrunning their evidence. And there's another layer to this. McKenna didn't just speculate, he performed speculation. He made it feel emancipatory. He made it feel brave. He made the act of moving beyond conventional reality sound like an ethical and aesthetic achievement in itself. Which means the danger wasn't simply that some of his ideas were weak. The danger was that the whole style of consciousness he modeled could encourage listeners to confuse transgression with truth. To assume that because an idea violates ordinary assumptions, it must therefore be deeper than ordinary thought. But reality isn't obligated to be most true at the point where it feels most transgressive. Sometimes the boundary you cross opens into insight, and sometimes it opens into self-enchantment. Sometimes it just opens into nonsense. The question now is no longer whether McKenna was interesting or even whether he was helpful. The question becomes whether his brilliance and its excess can actually be separated. Was the overreach a distortion of the gift or part of the gift itself? Would McKenna have become the McKenna people remember if he had stayed disciplined, cautious, and empirically modest? Probably not. The force of his thought came partly from his refusal to stop when most people stop. But refusal has a shadow. If you refuse every boundary, eventually you also refuse the ones that protect you from your own appetite for meaning. And beneath all of this is a more intimate problem. McKenna is easy to treat as an exotic case, a psychedelic outlier, a countercultural bard who got carried away with his own imagination. But that lets us off too easy. The deeper truth is that he dramatizes something recognizable in all of us. We all want certain experiences to mean more than they can bear. We all want our intuitions confirmed by the shape of the world. We all feel the seduction of private coherence. We have all at some point taken the emotional intensity of a moment as proof that we were finally seeing clearly. McKenna's issue is simply that ordinary human temptation, magnified by psychedelics, intellect, charisma, and an almost mythological confidence in imagination itself. He doesn't show us what happens when a thinker goes too far. He shows us what happens when the hunger for transcendence stops being balanced by the discipline of doubt. We aren't left with anything resolved or tidied or rescued by either devotion or ridicule. By now the story has become more disturbing than a tale of eccentric theories. We are looking at a mind that wanted so badly to restore enchantment to the world that it sometimes blurred the difference between uncovering mystery and manufacturing it. And once that line starts to vanish, the real danger isn't error. It's enchantment without restraint. The mistake people often make with figures like Terence McKenna is that they assume there are only two ways to hold them. Either you treat them as prophets who saw what the rest of us were too conditioned to notice, or you treat them as cranks who got too high and too carried away and built castles out of hallucination. But real people, especially influential people, are rarely that easy. And once the heat of our critique cools a little, once we stop asking whether McKenna was right in any final sense, a more interesting question begins to emerge. What was he actually trying to answer? What wound in modern life was he pressing on so insistently? Because even if many of his grander claims collapse under scrutiny, the need he was speaking to does not collapse with them. It remains, and that's where the revelation begins. McKenna understood, perhaps more clearly than many of his contemporaries, that the modern crisis is not only political, economic, or technological. It is existential. It is a crisis of participation, a crisis of felt meaning, a crisis in the relationship between human consciousness and the world it inhabits. Modernity has given us extraordinary explanatory power, but explanation is not the same thing as belonging. You can describe a forest and still have no relationship with it. You can model human behavior statistically and still have no language for the sacred, the mysterious, the numinous, or the transformative. You can know more and more about the world while feeling less and less at home inside it. McKenna saw that fracture. And that's why his ideas found such fertile ground. Not because everyone accepted his claims literally, but because many people recognized the condition he was diagnosing. The flattened world, the disenchanted world, the world reduced to utility, production, and management. McKenna kept insisting that consciousness could not be adequately understood inside that frame. He insisted that nature was not merely raw material, that myth was not childish residue, that symbol mattered, that direct experience mattered, that ecstasy mattered. That the imagination was not a decorative feature of human life, but one of the places where reality became available to us in a richer form. Even when he overstated things, he was often pushing against something real. A culture that had become so committed to the measurable that it had begun to mistrust whatever could not be neatly quantified. And perhaps that's the way to understand him properly, not first as a reliable guide to the architecture of the cosmos, but as a witness to the hunger that modern people do not know what to do with. The hunger for enchantment, the hunger for depth, the hunger to feel that consciousness is not just an accidental byproduct of matter, flickering briefly before extinction, but something more intimate with the structure of reality. Whether that hunger leads to wisdom or delusion depends on how it's held, but the hunger itself is not absurd, it is deeply human. McKenna's significance lies partly in the fact that he refused to pathologize it. He refused to shrug it away as romantic weakness or irrational residue. He gave it language, he gave it dignity, he made it speakable. Many people live with a quiet split inside themselves. Outwardly, they function within the modern frame. They go to work, they pay their bills. They behave as though the world is as ordinary as it appears. But inwardly, they carry experiences, intuitions, dreams, symbols, moments of terror, moments of beauty, moments of impossible significance that do not sit neatly inside that story. McKenna spoke to that hidden population, not by offering caution, usually, but by offering recognition. He made people feel less alone inside their own strangeness. And whatever else we say about him, that is not a trivial thing. It may even be one of the reasons he remained so beloved. He didn't merely theorize altered consciousness, he made people feel that their most difficult, ecstatic, or inexpressible experiences belong to a larger human conversation. There's also something important in the way McKenna stood at the meeting point of several historical currents. He belonged partly to the psychedelic revival, partly to ecological consciousness, partly to countercultural suspicion of institutions, partly to the emerging digital age, which fascinated him as both promise and threat. He could sound archaic and futuristic at the same time. He talked about shamans and virtual reality, mushrooms and cyberspace, ancient ritual and post-human possibility. That blend now feels strangely contemporary. In many ways, McKenna anticipated a world in which spiritual hunger, information overload, technological acceleration and suspicion of official narratives would all begin feeding one another. He didn't invent that condition, of course, but he was an unusually vivid early expression of it. But what if McKenna's greatest value lies not in the truth of his theories, but in the shape of the questions he forced open? What if his role was not that of a map maker giving us the correct cartography of consciousness, but that of a signal flare? A reminder that the official map is incomplete. A reminder that human beings require more than systems, efficiencies, and descriptions. A reminder that wonder, though unreliable, is not irrelevant. And a reminder that the imagination can distort reality, but it can also reveal how impoverished our accepted descriptions have become. That's a subtler, stronger way of reading him. Because once you stop demanding literal certainty from every part of McKenna's vision, you can begin to see the symbolic truth running underneath it. His work says something like this: modern people are starving for contact with a reality that feels alive. They are starving for forms of knowing that include the body, the image, the symbol, the ecstatic, the intuitive, and the communal. They are starving for a relationship to nature that is not merely extractive. They are starving for mystery, not as superstition but as a corrective to the arrogance of total explanation. McKenna may not have solved that hunger. He may at times have exploited it, even if unconsciously, but he named it. And naming a hunger is often the first step in understanding it. This is also where compassion becomes important. Not sentimental compassion, not the soft sort that excuses everything because someone was brilliant or sincere. I mean the clearer kind. The kind that sees a human being trying, with extraordinary intelligence and equally extraordinary excess, to force open a door that modern culture preferred to keep shut. There's something admirable in that, even if it went too far. There's something recognizable in it too. Most of us, if we're honest, have tried in our own smaller ways to make life mean more than it appears to mean on the surface. We've taken an experience and asked more of it than it could give. We've felt moments that seemed larger than the frameworks available to us. We have wanted the world to answer back. McKenna simply lived that desire out loud at operatic scale. And perhaps that's the revelation. Not that he discovered the final truth, not that his theories secretly explain history, not that the mushrooms were handing him a clean metaphysical blueprint, but that he exposed with unusual intensity the unfinished business of modern consciousness. The fact that we are still trying to work out how to be rational without becoming spiritually numb. How to remain open to mystery without surrendering to fantasy. How to seek transformation without handing ourselves over to seduction. How to speak about the strange without becoming captive to it. That is the whole shape of it now. Terence McKenna wasn't just a psychedelic lecturer with a gift for grand ideas. He was a symptom of something deeper and a response to it at the same time. A symptom of modern dislocation. A response to modern deadness. A man who may have gone too far in trying to re-enchant the world, but who also proved by the force of that attempt how badly many people wanted the world enchanted again. And once you see that, everything changes. Because the story's no longer about whether McKenna succeeded, it's about why so many people needed him to try. So, where does all of this leave us? After the brilliance, the excess, the seduction, the collapse, and the strange clarity that follows it, what are we actually meant to do with Terence McKenna? Because this is the temptation with figures like him, to sort them too quickly, to place them in one of the drawers our culture keeps ready for difficult people. Visionary, charlatan, mystic, fraud, genius, fool, sage, entertainer. But the truth is more awkward than that, and more useful. McKenna wasn't easy to classify because he was speaking to something in us that is not easy to classify either. He was speaking to the part of the human being that doesn't want to live in a world that's been fully explained away. Now, most of us live somewhere between two instincts. On one side, we want clarity, we want evidence, we want discipline, we want some defense against our own capacity for self-deception. But on the other side, we want wonder, we want depth. We want to feel that life is more than administration, more than utility, more than survival with better gadgets. We want a world that feels alive enough to meet us. And if we're being honest, many of us spend our lives lurching between those two impulses, trying not to become either gullible or spiritually numb. McKenna lived inside that tension. He just leaned harder than most people do. That, I think, is why he still lingers, not because he proved any of his grandest claims, and not because his more speculative theories turned out to be right, but because he dramatized a problem that hasn't gone away. How do you remain open to the mystery of existence without becoming easy prey for your own appetite for meaning? How do you keep the soul alive without abandoning the discipline of thought? How do you seek transformation without mistaking every intense experience for revelation? Now, these aren't psychedelic questions, really. They're human questions, and they show up everywhere. They show up in religion, where genuine spiritual hunger can drift into dogma, fantasy, or cultish certainty. They show up in politics, where the need for meaning and belonging can harden into ideology. They show up in relationships, where projection can be mistaken for love. They show up in grief, where pain sometimes drives us to build stories that help us survive, even if those stories distort what's actually there. They show up in self-help, in conspiracies, in online subcultures, in therapy, in art. They show up anywhere a human being wants life to cohere more beautifully than reality may be willing to allow. McKenna's not separate from those tendencies. He's an especially vivid expression of them. And yet that's only half of it. Because if we focus only on the danger, we miss something essential. We miss the fact that the modern world has made the opposite mistake just as often. It's cultivated a style of intelligence that can become afraid of anything it can't measure cleanly. It's trained people to mistrust symbolism, intuition, reverence, and altered experience unless they can be translated immediately into acceptable language. It has left many people with a perfectly functional description of reality and no felt relationship to it whatsoever. That's not wisdom either. A life can become just as distorted by the absence of wonder as by its excess. And this is where McKenna remains valuable. He reminds us that the hunger for enchantment is not childish. It's not evidence of stupidity. It's not something to be mocked out of existence by cleverness. It is part of the structure of being human. We want to feel connected to something larger than our routines. We want our consciousness to mean something. We want beauty to be more than decoration. We want moments of awe to count. We want the world to feel inhabited, not empty. Now, the problem's not that we want those things. The problem is how easily that want can become a trap. That, in the end, might be the real lesson of Terence McKenna. Not that transcendence is false, and not that transcendence is simple, but that the search for it demands more of us than hunger alone. It demands humility. It demands discernment. It demands the ability to say, this mattered to me deeply, without rushing to conclude, therefore it must explain the cosmos. It demands that we learn how to be altered without being unmoored. It demands that we learn how to honour mystery without turning it into theatre. Now, McKenna carried both. He carried a powerful critique of modern deadness and the dangerous susceptibility to overreach. He carried a real sensitivity to what was missing in modern consciousness and an equally real tendency to build too much on unstable ground. He could reveal something profound about the hunger for meaning, then immediately step beyond what that insight could responsibly support. He could open the window and fog the glass in the same moment. And perhaps that's why he remains more interesting than many cleaner thinkers. Because cleaner thinkers often leave us with arguments. McKenna leaves us with a predicament. How do we make room for wonder without surrendering ourselves to seduction? How do we seek richer forms of consciousness without confusing intensity with truth? And how do we resist a flattening of modern life without compensating by constructing private mythologies that cut us loose from reality altogether? Of course, there are no neat answers to that, and perhaps there shouldn't be. A figure like McKenna isn't useful because he resolves the tension. He's useful because he keeps it visible. He forces us to confront the fact that the human being is not built for a purely mechanical world, but is also not safe in a world where every shimmer is treated as revelation. We need mystery. We also need restraint. We need openness, and we also need skepticism. We need imagination, but we also need the courage to question the stories imagination produces. And that balance isn't a destination, it's a practice. And perhaps that's the real ground we return to at the end of this episode. Not the ground of certainty, but the ground of maturity. The recognition that the deepest questions in life cannot be solved by reducing mystery to chemistry, but neither can they be solved by inflating every altered state into metaphysical proof. We live between those extremes. We always have. Terence McKenna spent his life trying to push beyond the prison walls of ordinary consciousness. Sometimes he found language that genuinely widened the mind. Sometimes he disappeared into his own reflections. But either way, he exposed something enduring. The modern person does not just want facts. The modern person wants contact. Contact with meaning. contact with awe, contact with a world that feels more alive than the one described by systems alone. It's not because he solved the mystery of consciousness, but because he refused to let us pretend there was no mystery there at all. There is something strangely fitting about the fact that Terence McKenna still lingers in the cultural imagination like a voice heard through smoke. Not fully clear, not fully gone. Still speaking to that part of the human being that resists reduction. That part that does not want to believe that consciousness is just chemistry, that beauty is just preference, that awe is just neurological weather passing through the skull. Because for all his excess, and there was excess, McKenna kept returning to a question that modern life still struggles to answer. What do we do with mystery? Not the cheap kind, not the manufactured kind, not the sort of mystery people use to avoid thinking. I mean the real thing. The experience of standing in the presence of someone you can't fully explain without also feeling that to explain it away would be a kind of betrayal. A moment of beauty, a psychedelic experience. A dream that seems to know more about you than you know about yourself. A sudden collapse of ordinary certainty. A glimpse, however brief, that reality might be deeper than the version you use to get through the day. Most of us had moments like that. Maybe not as dramatically as McKenna, maybe not in the Amazon or under the influence of 5 dry grams of psilocybin in silent darkness, but in quieter ways. Through grief, through love, through art, through fear. Through those rare moments when the world feels less like an object and more like a presence. And then what? That's where the difficulty begins. Because once mystery enters your life, you have choices. You can deny it and retreat into flatness. You can worship it and lose your footing. Or you can try, as imperfectly as any human being can, to stay in relationship with it without letting it swallow your judgment whole. McKenna didn't always manage that balance. In many ways, this entire episode has been about what happens when a brilliant mind reaches for depth and sometimes goes too far. But it's also been about something more generous than that. It's been about the fact that he kept reaching. He kept insisting that reality was not exhausted by its most ordinary descriptions. He kept refusing the dead language of a fully disenchanted world. And I think that's why he's still relevant. Not because he should be believed in the way one believes a doctrine, and not because his theories need to be defended like sacred architecture, but because he reminds us that the human need for wonder doesn't disappear just because modern culture finds it inconvenient. It waits, it goes underground, it appears in symbols, in subcultures, in obsessions, in breakdowns, in revelations, in strange books and stranger voices. McKenna was one of those voices. And maybe the most honest thing we can say at the end of all this is that he leaves us with the same task he could never quite resolve for himself. To remain open without becoming gullible. To remain skeptical without becoming spiritually numb. To seek depth without turning every shimmer into a system. Because the mystery is still here. The question is what kind of person you become in its presence. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for tuning in today. Your time, presence and attention are, as always, deeply appreciated. If you want to keep wandering through this philosophical wreckage with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital purgatories. My favourite places, we're on TikTok, Instagram and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye. And we are on Substack, which is the home of the podcast, at theobservingeye.com. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or whatever platform you use to enjoy these delightful episodes. You, of course, can also drop me an email. I've had this open for a while at david@theobservingeye.com. Now, I do read them, and I do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to recommend a subject for an episode, or want to say hi, or want to wax philosophical, or just tell me I'm talking shit, you are very welcome to send me a message. And just to say thank you to all of you who have messaged me already. I really appreciate your feedback and your comments, and it's just nice to hear from you all. We're going to be back next week, of course, continuing our run with the Psychonaut season with the psychologist turned spiritualist Richard Alpert, who you may know better as Bubba Rum Dus. Until then, take care everybody, much love, and I'll catch you soon.